There is what we call a withdrawal period from antibiotics. So one, it's on the antibiotics themselves, and two, it's mandated by the USDA that has to happen. And long story short, what that means is if a rancher has to administer antibiotics to an animal, they have to hold them for a certain period of time to allow those antibiotics to leave their system. Because just as if you and I had an infection a year ago and took antibiotics for it, we would need to take a new course if we got sick again, because they don't stay in your system. There's a period that the animal has to be held if it has been administered antibiotics before it's sent for slaughter, to ensure that that meat is antibiotic-free. And there's a guy I've been following lately who is a rancher himself, and he points out, why would we want to go to the expense of giving animals antibiotics for no reason? They're not cheap. And the reality is animal welfare is distributing antibiotics where necessary. If your animal injures itself and you're a rancher, you have a duty of care to that animal to do that. And then you have a duty of care to your consumers to wait that voluntary withholding period or withdrawal period for the antibiotics to leave the system. There's a heme in the meat that determines the color. I'm sure you and your followers know about myoglobin. That's the protein in the meat that gives it its color. And it cycles through different colors from purple to red to brown, depending on the stages and depending on exposure to oxygen. So, for example, if you guys have prepared meat once and you cut it and it's sort of blooming red, and then you stack your steaks on top of the other, and then you peel them back after a while and the steaks that were touching each other are now brown, that's called metmyoglobin. That's because it was exposed to oxygen, and when you had them touching each other, now they're not. So that metmyoglobin starts to form. It's important to remember that that's purely a color and in no way represents freshness of the meat. The best way to test for freshness is the smell. Carbon monoxide will hold that red color. So they invented what they call MAP packaging, which is the ones where you see those firm trays, that the steaks in the molded trays and the plastic wrap on top. Those usually have, or can have, you can also have carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide in it as the state that it's being held. It's not harmful in any way. It doesn't enter the meat. It doesn't enter the meat and then enter you. I guess a great example would be salt. I could tell you that salt is a toxin because it is when it's taken in quantities that are too large. But you guys know and are comfortable with that a regular amount of salt is actually not a problem at all. And it's the same thing with something like carbon monoxide on a slightly different level, because you're not ingesting it. Promote a cooking type that I naturally found myself doing called just keep flipping. I personally like the taste of a charcoal grill the best for steaks. I know that's not practical all the time, but I find that cooking over extremely high heat and flipping often will allow that Maillard reaction to happen, which is the browning crust compounds on the outside, which is really significant for flavor development, but it will stop any overcooking on any one side. So if your preference is a rare, a medium rare, or a very specific doneness, other than well done, of course, you can really nail that doneness and still get that crust development, which is how I like my steak. There are other folks who would rather see a grill mark on it, the crosshatch grill mark, because that to them is the hallmark of a great cooked steak. But when you see those, you don't get as aggressive a crust and flavor development as if you sear the whole thing. One of the disadvantages, in my opinion, of leaving it on one side to build that crust is you do start getting that grain band, so you're not getting as much medium rare all the way through. And then there's there are people who love to butter sear. I don't. I think it interrupts the flavor of the beef. And also butter has water content in it. So I see a question as well about scraping the top of the steak. To get that Maillard reaction, we have to have the driest surface possible. So rather than scraping, you can always use a paper towel to dry your meat off before you start. It'll automatically put you ahead of the game in terms of getting that really nice crust starting. And the problem when our pans are not hot enough, which is a big issue for domestic stoves, if you've ever been in a restaurant kitchen, their gas ranges are not messing around. Like, they have some serious power. And what we have in our kitchens frequently are very low powered gas flames, and we put a skillet on it and it gets kind of hot, but not all the way hot. And then you add the steak in, and because that heat isn't there and can't stay hot, The water is released, which brings the temperature down. That's when you end up with that kind of watery surface on your steak. It's the same concept as when they tell you not to add too much ground meat to your pan at once. Don't overcrowd the pan to allow for browning. That's all about that heat and how quickly it can boil the water off to keep that surface searing nice and well. Really understanding food safety, understanding the color change, understanding how to best cook it opens your world up completely to really being empowered when you're standing at the grocery store or the meat counter or your local butcher or your local rancher is sending you packages and you know what to do with it. You're not standing there going, "Ooh, I'm not, shouldn't I?" We're taught that it's full of clandestine, evil corporations. And certainly there are 4 big companies that are have the market share of meat companies, but they get their meat from small ranchers. They don't own every animal from the ground up that they sell. And every rancher that I've met and everybody I've met in ag is always willing to share and be very transparent and is very proud of what they do. And I think that that's a message that gets lost a lot. Ones I would look for, the flat iron or the infraspinatus. Incredible, second most tender to the tenderloin, packed with flavor. The teres major, also in the shoulder, very, very tender. The skirt steaks, I absolutely love for doing carne asada, just grilled skirt steaks. The outside skirt, which is actually the one inside the rib cage, is significantly more tender than the inside skirt. I also love bavette and I love top sirloin. I think that it can be so tender, but it's got some chew to it, which is what I want from beef. And it's got so much flavor. The picanha, which is that top sirloin cap or top rump cap. I also don't think there's anything wrong with ground beef. It's very versatile and there's a lot you can do with it. I harvest my own deer as well. And when I first started, I tried to kind of be a hero about, making sure that I was cutting it into all these little cuts. Well, a deer's much, much, much smaller than a cow. And, there's no shame in grinding it because we eat a lot of deer chili in the winter. A tri-tip is another one, a great one that you can look out for. And the other thing that I want to tell you about vacuum sealing, which is really significant, if you've ever heard the term wet aging or any kind of aging of steak, literally vacuum sealed meats are being wet aged. Now, if you freeze them, that aging will stop. But effectively what you're doing is giving them that controlled environment to allow the enzymes to break down some of those connections at the core of the muscle that will tenderize them. It breaks down the Z lines. It will literally tenderize the meat, Shawn, as you let it sit there on your refrigerator for a week or two. So the enzymatic reaction is the same in that you're giving the meat a controlled environment to do its thing and to let those enzymes naturally break down. If you wet age for too long, never leave it past 28 days, and you'll start developing those really sour notes to the meat. Conversely, dry aging can actually improve flavor because it creates a separate flavor profile. First thing that dry aging does, which wet aging does not, it allows the water to leave the meat, which concentrates the beef flavor, which is really interesting. But you want to use a dedicated facility like a dedicated dry aging fridge, and you want it to have humidity control because you need to dial that in exactly to stop seams from opening up in the meat where bacteria can get. If that's happening, you can't medium rare your steaks anymore or rare your steaks because now you've got bacteria inside the muscle and it's no longer sterile. The idea is that in these controlled environments, you can introduce certain desirable bacteria, much like the bacteria or the mold in a blue cheese. And you can develop these nutty, interesting, complex flavors, which is either you love it or you don't, but some people are obsessed with it once they try it. It does need a controlled environment. It needs an understanding of what that environment should be, what you're aiming for, how to trim it once it's aged. You still need to get rid of that rind. For example, as well, those dry aging bags are very popular. Certainly they work a little bit better than a vacuum seal traditionally because they do let moisture out, but they do let off smells from the refrigerator in. So I'm not the hugest fan of them, but they are a safe and cost-effective option for people who are looking to try that.